Tonight on Greater Boston, I'm Adam Riley in for Jim Browdy. As the war in Ukraine continues, Russia so far has held off on launching the cyber attack on the U.S. that experts fear. But President Biden has publicly warned that, quote, it's coming. How should we as a country prepare? And what, if anything, can ordinary people do to get ready? Plus, the American Psychiatric Association has added prolonged grief disorder to their manual of psychiatric disorders. But was it the right call? Two experts weigh in. And the local kids raising money on their own to help Ukrainian children fleeing war. Russia's assault on Ukraine is now in its 29th day, with a continuous stream of images of destruction and death coming from the outmanned nation as it puts up a strong but costly fight. In response to the growing humanitarian crisis, President Biden announced today, while in Brussels for emergency talks with NATO, that the U.S. would accept 100,000 refugees fleeing Ukraine out of the 3.6 million that have been displaced so far. Also on Washington's mind, the possibility that Putin might turn his sights on us via a different kind of attack, not one with traditional military means, but aimed instead at essential economic and technological systems, as the White House warned earlier this week.
One of the tools he's most likely to use, in my view, in our view, is cyber attacks. They have a very sophisticated cyber capability. The magnitude of Russia's cyber capacity is fairly consequential, and it's coming. The federal government is doing its part to get ready.
There's still much more we need to do to have the confidence that we've locked our digital doors, particularly for the critical services Americans rely on.
So what exactly would a Russian cyber attack on the U.S. look like, and how should big companies and institutions and maybe ordinary people respond? I'm joined now by Lauren Zabrick, Executive Director of the Cyber Project at Harvard Kennedy School's Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs, and Michael Siegel, Director of Cybersecurity at MIT's Sloan School of Management. Thank you both for being here. Lauren, to my ear, those comments from President Biden suggest that a cyber attack is either highly likely or inevitable. Do you share that assessment?
I think where the president is telling us that this is a credible threat and trailing, the entire United States, looking at the different private sector organizations, critical infrastructure, things like that, then yes, there is credibility to that threat. And of course, when we think of a threat, we think of intent plus capability. And so what he's saying is we already know the capability exists. So what he's likely saying is that the intent is actually starting to materialize.
Michael, what is your assessment?
Well, very good. I agree that the capability is very much there. But realizing in cyber attack, we have the word attack. And I do have some amount of, I think there must be some amount of caution with the idea of an actual attack of the United States. So up to this point, we've had the Russians attack the Ukraine, we've had sanctions, but an actual attack on the US, though a cyber attack, might be considered very differently. So I agree strongly that the capability is there. I'm just not sure that we know or have a full understanding of the consequences of an attack.
Well, let's try to talk through some of those right now. My sense, and I am not an expert at all, unlike the two of you, but my understanding is that Russia, prior to the war in Ukraine, did some work disabling the Ukrainian power system. Am I getting that correct? What are some of the things that, if an attack did occur here in the U.S., what might we see? What might that mean in practice? And Lauren, you can start, and then we can hear from Michael.
Sure. Well, cyber attacks happen every day. And I think that we in this community need to do a much better job at communicating what that actually means to the public. So I think for a public, they hear attack and they think perhaps active war. And that's not what we're talking about here. We see so much activity in the cyber domain, millions of attacks per day against our businesses, our government infrastructure, and things like that. And so, there are, I think, a couple of different flavors that this could potentially take. Now, whether such an attack would reach the threshold of war, that's what we don't know. And so when we say threshold of war, we're talking things like significant loss of life, significant injury or harm, significant disabling of our critical infrastructure, or really essential services in our public safety systems, things like that.
That's what I find myself, and I'm very much a catastrophic thinker, so I always imagine the worst. Coupling that with ignorance is probably not a good recipe, but I imagine waking up one morning and not having running water in my home, or not having power, or not being able to access my bank account. Michael, are those overheated imaginings on my part, or are those within the realm of possibility?
Well, again, with regard to capability, I certainly think they're in the realm of possibility. With regard of when you cross the line, that's the question you have to ask. Russia has for many years had many, I would say, sanction groups, which have, committed major attacks against the United States, against corporations in the United States. And the energy system, for example, has been probed, and recently they reported, several probes of the energy, several energy system networks. So the capability is there. The issue is, and Belfer Center has certainly done a lot of excellent work on this with regard to policy and understanding when cyber can become an act of war. The real question is, when do you cross that line? So if you send a few of your sanctioned organizations to maybe shut down a business here or shut down a business there, you probably get away with it. It makes front page, probably gets associated with, Putin and associated with Russia, but it may not cross the line. If you start to cut off energy, electricity, so on and so forth, I think you start to cross a line, and that's when we don't know what happens. That's when we don't know.
Lauren, what is your assessment of what the people who run the systems that we rely on, and I know there's more of them than I can even start to name here, what's your assessment of how seriously they are taking this threat, and whether they're doing the things right now that they should be to brace for potentially disruptive worst-case scenarios?
Well, I think it's important to remember that most of the organizations that run these services are in the private sector. So that's one thing that we need to keep in mind. And that has a whole host of considerations for things like, international humanitarian law and law of armed conflict and things like that. But as far as what they're doing, to secure these systems, cybersecurity is a long game. It's a long-term investment. And while it is true, we do not have regulations for cybersecurity, across these sectors, except, maybe for the energy sector. I will say what we've seen in the last couple of weeks, even the last year, after the administration has come into, to the government and, put into place people like Ann Newberg, like Director Jen Easterly, like Director Chris Inglis from the National Cyber Director, there's a real focus on trying to improve the state of our cybersecurity across our nation. And so we've seen a lot of advisories, joint advisories from CISA, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, from FBI, warning companies and really trying to push them to work together, work with the government, share information, and back and forth, right? From the government to the private sector and from the private sector to the government. And I think we've seen a lot of progress there. And, where they've put out the Shields Up advisories, I think that organizations are taking them very seriously. It's just, again, are we making those long-term investments, but also are we making more short-term things too, things like strong random passwords across accounts and multi-factor authentication and things like that.
That's actually a perfect transition to another thing I wanted to ask both of you about, which is what, if any, agency ordinary people can exercise if this threat or this array of threats is looming on the horizon. It makes you want to do something, but I'm not a systems administrator. I'm just, a guy who works at WGBH and I'm on email sometimes, I'm on Twitter sometimes. Michael, what can average people do to ramp up their own security in a moment like this? What should we do?
Well, I do think people, if security becomes part of our thought process and part of our sort of daily activities, if we do sign on for two-factor authentication and do those types of things that are recommended to us, I think it strengthens us as a whole. So I think that's a good a good starting point for things. To some extent, we also should think about what happens to some extent if the electricity goes off and what happens. And so we may want to be prepared. Some people may want to be prepared if they have difficult access to medicines or difficult access to things that might be affected by an outage or whatever. They may want to prepare for that to some extent, because preparing for cybersecurity is not just prevention and detection, it's also response. So even as individuals, we have to have a way to respond to some shortage or something that might occur. I also want to mention just one thing. I think it's important to realize, I think the government has done an excellent job. I've worked a lot with the energy sector. I think there's a lot of preparation that has been put in place. Our people are very talented. There's a lot of skills. But when it comes right down to it, cybersecurity is asymmetric warfare. You need only one access point. Yeah. The threat actor needs one place to get in. And as a company or as an energy sector or whatever, we need to protect every access point. And so that's a difficult job for a defender. And ultimately, we not only want to defend, but we want, and just as you ask on a personal level, we want to be able to respond or react to things that occur.
Lauren,
we want our tabletop exercises, and we want to be able to do things. Yes.
Lauren, you got the last word here. Just in about 20 seconds, are there things ordinary people should do to be safe or be prepared?
Absolutely. Yeah. So, we're all vulnerable, right, in the digital realm. And so things like, as I mentioned, having strong random passwords across all of your accounts, having something like multi-factor authentication, regularly updating your software and your devices. And of course, remember that phishing, where someone sends you a link or an attachment, is still the #1 attack vector. So don't click on those links or open those attachments when you don't know where they come from.
Thank you for that. I will now update my iPhone after we finish this interview. Lauren Zabrook and Michael Siegel, thank you both.
Thank you.
Next, how long should it take to grieve the loss of a loved one? According to the DSM-5, the answer could be not as long as many of us might think. The American Psychiatric Association recently added prolonged grief disorder to their manual of psychiatric disorders to describe individuals who are experiencing, quote, an intense yearning or longing for or preoccupation with the deceased person. Their bereavement lasts longer than social norms and causes distress or problems functioning. The inclusion of this new diagnosis in the DSM will allow clinicians to bill insurance companies for treating it, which could be good news for people in mourning who feel they need help. But critics of the new diagnosis say it pathologizes a normal part of the human condition, and that expecting bereaved individuals to just return to the way they lived before their losses on a strict timetable is unreasonable and unfair. So when it comes to prolonged grief disorder, do the positives outweigh the negatives? Megan Devine, creator of Refuge in Grief, joins me now, along with New York Times mental health reporter Ellen Berry. Thank you both for being here. Megan, as you see it, what are the implications of this diagnosis going to be for people who are bereaved in the years to come?
I think the impact it's weird, because what does one little diagnosis in a clinical manual mean to the average person? And honestly, for a lot of the different mental health conditions that are listed in the DSM, we would never know about them. But with grief, with prolonged grief disorder, because grief affects so many people, and because we're starting to talk about this new diagnosis in the DSM, suddenly it's on everybody's minds, right? We're certainly still in the middle of a mass death and mass disabling event with the pandemic. People are grieving all sorts of things. So anytime we start having a conversation about grief in the public media, we start talking about what's normal and what isn't normal. And then we get this official thing from the medical industry that says that if you're sad or you're missing your person or you're having a hard time focusing, suddenly there's something wrong with you. So this is the real problem with something like prolonged grief disorder, especially when it hits sort of mass public media, is it doubles down on that message that having an emotional response to losing somebody you love should be cleaned up and over with really quickly. And you shouldn't be sad for longer than 6 months. You shouldn't be missing them or having them in your thoughts for more than a year. it just does such a disservice not only to grieving people, but also to friends and family who want to be supportive, and they're really being taught the wrong ways to do that.
Your work is deeply informed by the loss of your partner. What has your experience taught you about the way grief does and doesn't operate?
It's such a big topic. I think there's a lot of mystery around what grief actually is. And that's actually one of the big issues with prolonged grief disorder being an official diagnosis. If you look at the criteria, it says an emotional response outside of social norms. Well, what are social norms? And who decides those social norms? We've certainly got a culture that is very deeply uncomfortable with emotion of any kind other than happiness, right? So we have this idea that sadness, depression, anxiety, anger, these are all sort of negative emotional states to be pushed through to get back to this normal health and happiness. So your question was like, what have I learned about grief, not only from my own experience, but from the last 10 years of listening to millions of grieving people and having them say, I feel like I'm the only one who feels like this. I don't know if I'm normal. My friends and family expected me to go back to my sunny, rosy, productive, hardworking personality that I was 6 weeks ago before my baby died. And we just have such a deep misunderstanding of grief, which is really a misunderstanding of what it means to be human, because all of us grieve something. So what I've really learned over the last 10 years is that the difference between our sort of medical, clinical ideas of what optimal human mental health is versus the lived reality of most people, they're two very, very different worlds. And you take something like prolonged grief disorder as this edict from the industry that says there's a right way and a wrong way. And then you've got the normal human whose sister just died of breast cancer, or your parent died of COVID, and I'm supposed to be performing to a certain level of mental health and wellness on a very strict timetable, and that's not how I feel.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Ellen Barry, you talked with proponents and critics of the new diagnosis for your piece, which I have seen circulated everywhere. It seems to be driving the discussion to a large extent. What did the people who think that this is a useful thing that will provide assistance to individuals who are suffering, what did they say to you to make their case?
The people that contributed to this decision and worked on it over a period of many years would say that it's a diagnosis that should apply to a very relatively small slice of people. So they say, I've heard 4%, I've heard 7%. So it's identifying particularly acute sufferers. And the way they describe it is this sort of persistent stuckness in pining and yearning and ruminating. So a bunch of pattern behaviors that we all go through when we have a traumatic loss or even a loss. But in this slice of patients, of people, of grievers, they weren't moving past it. And so for this 4%, some treatment may help. And that is the group that they're looking at. I think what's complex here is that when you define what's abnormal, you're also defining what's normal. And because, as Megan said, so many of us have had this experience ourselves, and the first thing we would say is that it's mysterious. It unfolds in ways you can't predict. And it's so human and it's so painful trying to draw some line between abnormal and normal. It's complicated.
It's a fraught exercise, right?
It really is.
Right.
Go ahead.
That said, when you hear the disorder, listen to people who have been diagnosed and treated for the disorder, they say, I was stuck. I couldn't stop thinking over the 3 days, while my child was suffering or dying, or I couldn't stop going over the experience in my head. Mm-hmm. And that this treatment helped them deal with that almost more as a PTSD type experience than a sadness experience. And I think that's something interesting, not only about the diagnosis, but about the therapies being suggested, is that they are more close to PTSD type therapies than depression therapies.
I went back before this conversation and looked at a piece that I did maybe 8 years ago. I spoke with a woman who was being treated for this in a trial program at Mass General Hospital when it was still a developing diagnosis. She spoke very compellingly about how this treatment had helped her out of a very, very dark place after the unexpected death of her husband from a brain aneurysm. One of the things she said she was able to do after getting this treatment, in the course of which she had this, to her, incredibly important conversation with him that she had never had before. She said it allowed him to integrate the memory of him and their life together in a way that she hadn't been able to before. She brought their belongings back from Europe where they had been left after he passed away. She started putting pictures of him up around her home and remembering their life together in a way she hadn't been able to before. And when I reread that, it got me wondering, and I'll start here with you, Megan, then Ellen, I'd love to get your thoughts on this. Is it possible that the assistance that this may provide for people who are in a very dark place could be a good thing, and the really problematic aspect of it is the definition, which you were talking about, Megan, a moment ago, telling people this is how it's supposed to be for every single one of us. Is that a fair analysis?
Yeah, I think that there are good elements in the diagnosis. However, how they're implemented and how they're used is pretty challenging. Actually, everything you just described, like this person came back and put photos of her dead husband up, in some ways that you could read the prolonged grief diagnosis, that would actually be a pathological thing, to put up photographs, to still be including that person in your life, right?
Yeah.
Who gets to decide what's pathology and what's normal? And that point, actually in the New York Times piece, I actually feel like that was one of the most balanced descriptions of the controversy. Normally they skew very heavily to yay pathology model. So thank you for that, Ellen. But this idea that that is only supposed to apply to a very small percentage of the population, that I think that's wishful thinking, right? There is a small percentage of people who are grieving a loss who really, really cannot function. We're talking about activities of daily living, right? Having a hard time eating, sleeping, not getting out of bed, anything that would be like clearly distressing, not just impacting quality of life, like I can't stop thinking about the accident, or my appetite is really off, or I'm not sleeping. Those are all really normal parts of grief. They're messy, but they're normal. So for a small percentage of the population, or a small percentage of grieving people, yeah, they really, really, really deserve some extra support just to get through those activities of daily living. But that's not what the language of prolonged grief disorder says.
And actually, I apologize for interrupting.
No.
Before I ask you, Ellen, I actually want to shift gears a little bit and ask you about the role that insurance coverage played in developing this diagnosis. But before we do that, to your point, Megan, some of the symptoms that are described in this new diagnosis, symptoms of prolonged grief disorder in the DSM, include identity disruption, sense of disbelief about the death, intense emotional pain, difficulty with reintegration, and intense loneliness, which to my eye are things that you might expect following a number of losses to exist for a lifetime. So my 2 cents.
Your 2 cents is right on with the lived experience of grieving people as well. You know, when you sort of take the psychological jargon out of that, what those things describe is sadness, missing them, wishing they were still here.
Yeah.
Right. When your parent dies, they stay dead. Right. There's no time that you're not going to miss them. If you hit a major milestone in your life, you're going to wish your dad was there. That is
I've done that
normal.
exact thing with my father. Yeah, since he passed away 10 years ago, and my own processing of it has been very uneven. It comes in fits and starts. A colleague of mine once said that she thought grief was like a plasma. And that has always stuck with me. For some reason, that metaphor works for me. Ellen, let me close with this question for you. To what extent was the development of this diagnosis driven by the way that we provide and fund mental health care in this country at this moment in time?
I think it was very much driven by researchers who are working on the problem, both working on therapies and also working on trying to define the problem, and had been working on it for 2 decades, really. And I think that's what pushed it through the system, their belief that they had a therapy that was really effective and that clinical trials showed it was effective. I think that's really what pushed it through. Of course, we do live in a world where clinicians need a DSM diagnosis in order to bill insurance.
Right.
And so that is part of the picture. It's also true that to get major funding for research into a condition, you need a diagnosis as well. So these are all part of the kind of economic structure of our medical system.
Which is also part of the problem, right? Because what foundation is the research standing on, right? If the research is looking at all of these displays of emotion, this expression of grief is actually a problem, and our goal is to erase all of that human emotion, then what is the funding and what does the research really look at?
I
So
would love.
I also think there's some concern that the pharmaceutical industry is going to start looking at grief as a target. And there's some drugs already in clinical trials.
Yeah, I can imagine the ads already, and I sort of don't really want to. I could talk to the two of you about this for another hour, but we have to leave it there. Ellen Berry and Megan Devine, thank you both for taking the time to talk this through.
Absolutely.
Finally, tonight, as the calls for aid from Ukraine grow louder by the day and leaders around the world continue to grapple with how best to provide that, others are taking things into their own hands, coming up with their own ideas to help however they can. When 11-year-olds Reese Bevan and Colin Urch of Wenham learned what was happening in Ukraine, they wanted to do something to help kids like them who'd been suddenly surrounded by war.
Some of them are crossing the border all by themselves. It's just so sad to think about that.
So they looked into some charities and decided they wanted to raise money for Voices of Children, a Ukraine-based group that provides psychological support to kids who've been harmed by the war. At first, they wanted to raise $500 through a bake sale. But then they landed on a different idea, Ukrainian mini flags, $5 each, with all proceeds going to the charity. They ordered hundreds of flags online, made up signs with some help from Reese's twin brother, William, and raised close to $1,000 in a single day between cash and Venmo.
I never really thought we'd get this much support. It just shows how big of a heart everyone has.
People, they're honking, stopping by, leaving. It's just been amazing. This makes me feel really happy that I'm actually doing something to help this awful thing that's happening.
Now their goal has gone from $500 to $5,000, and they're on the hunt for someone to match their donation as well. As of this taping, they've raised approximately $3,000 since starting just yesterday morning. You can find out more information about their efforts and Voices of Children's work at kidsforukraine.me. That's it for tonight, but come back tomorrow for Talking Politics. We'll dig into some big changes possibly coming to the Boston public school system. Plus, candidate for governor Sonia Chang Diaz joins me to talk about what she believes is her path to victory. That and more tomorrow at 7. Thanks for watching and stay safe.